Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, Jessica joins me and we're going to discuss JavaScript and some of the stuff that she's up to these days at Free Code Camp. But before we get to that, Jessica, could you maybe just give me a brief overview of what kind of your tech story looks like so far? I know you kind of transitioned into tech from kind of some other fields. So yeah, if you could just give me a rundown of your kind of tech story so far.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Jessica Wilkins. And so before I got into tech, I was actually a professional musician, mainly within like operas and orchestras out in Los Angeles. And so I spent 8+ years doing that. I have degrees in music. And so I was an oboist and I would do like recording sessions and orchestra concerts and musicals and all that fun stuff and teaching. And so I kind of lived that life all the way up until about the pandemic. And then obviously we couldn't like perform anymore. And so during that time, though, there were also a lot of, political issues and race issues going on. And it kind of spilled into the conversation about inequality, race inequality in different industries, including the one I was in like the classical world, so to speak, within the music industry, and lack of diversity. And so people were asking me about like different websites or different, where they can learn more about Black composers in the past and present and whatnot. And I had accumulated all these different profiles and had done research on my own. But a lot of people just didn't know about all of these great composers from the past and the current that were doing incredible things. And so I just found myself sharing the same links over and over. And I was like, there should just be one website for this. And I was like, well, maybe I'll create that website because I've got more time, obviously, because of the pandemic. And so I started learning how to code in June of 2020, and then kind of just took off from there. I originally didn't anticipate like going into it full time. I thought the pandemic would let up and I would just go back to my old life there. But I really took to coding and fell in love with it and decided to make a career change. And so I started learning with Free Code Camp and started building personal projects and then started just kind of networking within the industry. And then I got my first job at a JavaScript consultancy and worked there for about a year and a half or so. And then just started working with Free Code Camp in August of 2023 there. And I've been there ever since.
Awesome. Very cool. And, I, like yourself, also transitioned into the web developer space. From my background was actually exercise science. I'm definitely not a musician by any standards. You would not want to hear that. So very cool. And when you kind of went to make that transition, so a lot of people, they really kind of struggle with it. They don't know where to start. They don't know whether they should take like a coding boot camp or if they should just use free materials online, if that's kind of good enough. Mm-hmm. Were you running into the same stuff, or how did you kind of like, okay, from step one, what did you build this website? What kind of resources did you use at that time, and kind of how did you kind of navigate that process?
Yeah. The early days can be tough because there's so much information. There's so much conflicting information there. And so originally I just wanted enough information to build my website. So I just Googled like how to code a website, and like HTML and CSS popped up. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll go learn that. And so I started off with this edX course, and then people in the comments were talking about Free Code Camp. And I was like, oh, okay, what's that? And so I started learning with that. And then it kind of just went down that rabbit hole. And so I kept finding more resources on like Udemy and stuff like that, and just trying different YouTube courses. But I ended up just sticking with Free Code Camp and going through those certifications, those early like front-end certifications there. And that gave me enough to build out the website that I was interested in, as well as other personal projects. And then I started learning more about the industry from there. And so I found just sticking with eventually one core resource and then having like other supplementary materials to kind of fill in extra areas kind of worked best for me there. But definitely the online self-taught route ended up being the best option for my personal situation there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I took a very similar approach. And, Free Code Camp was definitely a resource I used. And one thing that I really liked about Free Code Camp and, kind of similar tools is that there's a lot of like interactivity to where you can actually, I believe Free Code Camp, it's been a little bit since I've learned new courses on Free Code Camp and stuff, but I believe there's like interactive where you can actually write code and like submit your kind of answers and stuff like that. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah. So we have a fully interactive curriculum where you go through and we've just overhauled the first two parts of our curriculum, which teach you HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it's an all project-based curriculum. And so beforehand, it was just a list of individual challenges. And when I was going through it, and probably when you were going through it, it was a whole bunch of smaller challenges right there. And now we overhauled it to you're building actual projects. And so you're going to learn about the different concepts in HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And so you'll build a project and learn about Flexbox. You'll build another project and build about CSS Grid. You'll build another project and learn about object-oriented programming. So like one of our projects is a platformer game and a shopping cart and all this fun stuff. And so it kind of connects it a little bit more because there was kind of a disconnect between how does HTML, CSS, and JavaScript work together. And so that's why we came up with this whole project-based curriculum while still making it interactive. So it leads you step by step. It'll give you directions and explain the concept, and then you write out some code, and then it runs against a test suite that we've set up there, and you just go from step to step, and you see a project build out in real time. You're like, oh, okay, cool. That's how everything is supposed to work together.
Yeah, and I really like that because I think that for someone just starting out, one of the barriers they run into is like getting their code editor set up and like just like getting their file system all structured and installing different packages to where if you have like a complete interactive interface where they can actually write code, run through some tests and stuff like that, I think it's super helpful. So very cool there. I'm sure that your answer to this next question might be a little bit biased considering where you currently work. But for someone kind of also looking to kind of make that transition, where would you suggest that they kind of start out? And just asking you this question, I kind of know where it's going to go. But
Yeah. So yeah, I'm definitely biased to point people towards Free Code Camp because that's where I got started. That's where I'm working now. But I think it's all like a lot of people will ask like, oh, should I just use one resource? And my answer I always give is like, have just one core resource and then have supplementary resources. Because what I found over the years working with different learners is that they'll jump around from course to course to course and they'll pick up the basic syntax, but they won't really dive deep enough into the more complex concepts there and build out some more complex projects. And so they'll pick up a little bit of syntax and then they'll pop over to another beginner course and pick up a little syntax and then pop over to another one. And then they look up, it's 2 years later and they haven't progressed as much as they think there. And so I always advise people to say, just pick one resource that you really like that works well with your learning style. And then just realize that there are going to be supplementary resources. So maybe a couple of YouTube videos here and there to kind of fill in some of those gaps. So I think that's the best way moving forward is have one core resource and then have some other to just kind of help you out along the way.
Yep. And I think that's also a really good approach. And, you know, I knew kind of your answer where I was going to go to there, but I would say that I've asked that question to other people that I've interviewed on this podcast, and a lot of them do say Free Code Camp is a great resource. So I'm willing to kind of vouch for Free Code Camp. I know Jessica probably has her own biases here, but I still think that it's a great resource regardless. And I also think that having like some structure as well of sticking to one kind of course or resource or whatever it is, and like actually doing the projects like to completion and actually finishing them out is definitely a good idea, because I've seen it just like you mentioned. And I even made this same mistake when I was kind of starting out, is I would kind of start a project. It would start to get kind of hard. I'd switch over to a different project. It'd start to get kind of hard. I'd switch over to a different one. And I just kind of kept bouncing back and forth. And like you said, it made it really hard to just kind of piece kind of everything together all in kind of one thing. So I think that's great. And when it came for you to actually like start applying for jobs, so it sounds like you use Free Code Camp and other resources to actually learn coding and kind of put those pieces together. But then it sounds like you also built some projects. So did you maybe put those into a portfolio and then kind of show those to potential employers? Or what was kind of your process for actually landing the job after you kind of learned the skill?
Yeah. So once I got to the point where I was interested in starting to apply for a job, and I would have been working kind of just some random like contract jobs and smaller opportunities, but then I was ready to do like a full-time software developer role. And so I started just kind of reaching out to my, network and seeing what opportunities were available. And a lot of people in my network had done apprenticeships at a company called This.Labs. And I had been familiar with that company because I had gone to a few of their online events. They had a lot of free online events that would happen a few times throughout the month. And so they would have like JavaScript workshops on their YouTube channels. And they would have it as live sessions there, and they would have panels, and then they would also have like women in tech meetings. And so I had been to a few of those, and so I started meeting a few of the women that actually had worked there in the past or were currently working there, and a few of them had actually gone through the apprentice program, which was basically a 3-month or 6-month program there where you would work on real world projects, and you would be paired with a senior mentor, and you would have like these 90-minute sessions with them, and you would get to just basically hang out with your mentor, talk to him about anything. And it was great. It was a great way to kind of onboard. So I was really interested in that. And so at that point I had built a few like personal projects that I was interested in. And the intention was to build a portfolio. And I was like, well, I'm going to apply for this. I want to see if it seems like it's open right now. And so I'll apply for it. And then maybe I could just show them my GitHub or something. And maybe I can build the portfolio later. And so I applied, and I was able to get started with the interview process pretty quickly, and got to go through that. And then after a few rounds of like behavioral interviews and technical interviews and stuff, then I was able to fortunately get that first job. And so I was fortunate that I didn't have to go through this long process with different companies, that I was able to get my first job with this company that I was really interested in. And luckily, I think the key was like just knowing a lot of people, because I knew like at that point, like 5 or 6 different people, including the CEO. And so that kind of helped. I think if I hadn't known all those people and I wasn't like a familiar face, I think it probably would have played out very differently in the like early days trying to get in and get that interview there.
Totally. And how did you kind of go about building those relationships? Like, is there advice that you would give someone to kind of, maybe build those relationships that might actually help them out? Because I know that, for me, I took the total like shotgun approach to applying to jobs, where I applied to like 200 different jobs, got one interview, and it worked out well for me from there. But it was definitely quite the grueling process of just applying to job after job after job. And if I would have had a kind of a network to lean on, to where I could have gotten like a recommendation for a certain company, or I knew someone working there, I think it would have helped a lot. So how did you kind of go about that?
Yeah. I think initially I had just always leaned very heavily on networking, because I mean, in my previous career, when I got out of school, because I went to school in the East Coast of the Midwest, in Rochester, and then for a bit, for a master's, I went to University of Michigan. And so when it came time to move back to California and start my professional career, I didn't really know anybody. And so I had tried the initial approach of just shotgunning my resume to all these contractors and trying to get teaching gigs. And it was just like crickets and silence. And so it was so demoralizing, because I was like, I know I have the skills, but I can't get anybody. And so those early, few months there, it was really difficult to get those first few gigs. And I learned pretty quickly the power of networking. Because how I got those first few gigs was because other people had heard me play, other people had worked with me and saw me teach, and so they started recommending me for jobs, and then the ball kind of got rolling that way. And so it taught me early on. I was like, I don't know if the shotgunning thing works for me personally, and so I kind of like carried that into in tech. And so from day one, I was always just building relationships, because I just wanted to learn like what this industry is about, and this was so different from the previous industry I was in. And I didn't really know anybody in tech. And so I just wanted to just build a whole bunch of relationships and just work with different people. And so I joined a few different Discord groups and started contributing to open source projects. And over time, started building relationships with people and getting to know them. And so when it came time to apply for jobs, they were like, well, maybe you should, look into this apprentice program. And I was like, oh, that looks cool. Yeah, maybe I should do that. And so I think it's just my earlier experiences, try the failed approach of trying to like shotgun my resume to different like teaching opportunities and music opportunities, kind of approach like helped me lean more heavily into networking, because I didn't want to go through that again if I could help it.
Totally. It's definitely a demoralizing approach to take, for sure. It can work. I've exhibit A of that happening, but I definitely think that putting in a little bit of work to get kind of more active in certain communities, of, joining some Discords or some other communities. And then, there's probably going to be active professional engineers in there. So you can ask them, like, do you know of any opportunities after you've kind of cultivated that relationship a little bit? And I think that's a much easier way to kind of get your foot in the door. So I think that's a really good kind of background on your transition to tech, and, advice for doing the same. But now to kind of transition into your kind of current role at FreeCodeCamp. So I know that you've helped kind of develop, I think, the new JavaScript course. Is that correct?
Yeah. And so I had joined FreeCodeCamp full time in August, and at that point, the team was already working on the new revamped JavaScript course and making it all project based. And so there's a total now of 21 projects, and we released it in December, just last month there as an early Christmas present to the FreeCodeCamp community. And so my role is just jump on and help build out some of the prototypes for the projects, and then also break the projects down into steps and tests. And so that was kind of a long process because if anybody's just familiar with the platform where you have you're coding something out and then you hit the check your code button and then it runs some tests there. And so my job was to create all those tests and create all those challenges and descriptions. And so it took a lot to kind of figure out the best like flow from step 1 to step 2 to step 3. Because it's one thing to like, and I think the whole team found this where the creating the prototypes were kind of the easy part because that was like the fun part where it's like, oh, cool, we have this idea, we have this Google sheet of different projects, and we kind of mapped out which concepts we absolutely had to teach there. And then we started assigning projects to it, and then we started picking up different projects and say, cool, we're going to build out a prototype, and then we'll have other people review it. And then once we could decide on the final code for that prototype, then it came time to actually break it down into steps. Like, how can I teach somebody to build this? And so we had to think about the best approach that's engaging, that's going to be helpful in an educational context, because we don't want to veer too much to one side where it's just like, oh, just write this. And then they're not thinking about what they're writing. But then we don't want to veer too much to the other side. So we had to find like that happy medium where making it engaging, and they have to think about the types of solutions. And so finding ways to kind of guide them through, and then breaking up the steps into small bite-sized pieces so they don't get overwhelmed and they're not trying to do too much per step. So that was kind of a learning curve for all of us, but I think we were able to release something that is really exciting, and the community has been really excited about it. And the great thing is it's open source, and so we've been working through some of the open issues on how to revise it and make it even better. And so in real time, the community feels like they're involved with making something even better that millions of people are going to end up using over time there.
Very cool. And I'm not sure how like user facing per se you are, but are you ever seeing like any kind of common problems that people are having when trying to learn JavaScript, or any kind of concepts that people kind of find are much more challenging than others, or anything like that that comes to mind when like trying to learn JavaScript?
Yeah. I think like one of the challenges is that most people, or a lot of people that are interested in web programming, they start off with HTML and CSS, which are, obviously very visual. You get to see that immediate result. And so if you add a background color to a page, you get to see that color unless you made some sort of mistake or something like that. And so you get to see that immediate result. And so I think a lot of people can wrap their head around that. But then they get to JavaScript and it's like, okay, I'm writing a whole bunch of code for this function, but it's not working, and I have no clue why it's not working. And so it gets a little bit more confusing because we went from, oh, I can't see my background color, to I wrote this function about a frequency counter and I have no clue how it's working and I have no clue how to debug it. And so it's a different set of skills because now we're transitioning into just like programming basics. And so that could be really difficult there because they're writing all this code and they're not entirely sure how everything is supposed to work, especially just those core basics of like variables and loops and conditionals. And they're saying, okay, well, I understand what all this is, but how do I combine all this stuff to build things? How do I build actual web applications? And so making that leap sometimes is very difficult for learners. So that's why we wanted this project-based curriculum, is to kind of walk them through step by step so they can see how objects and arrays and if statements and while loops and all this, how that connects together with HTML and CSS, and how they can build interactive web pages.
I totally agree. I think that, HTML and CSS, they're very kind of like imperative, and like you just like exactly what you say is what you see on the page. And there's not like a ton of like abstract concepts. It's like, okay, background blue. It's like people can really wrap their head around kind of the styling stuff, as well as, okay, this is a header element. It's going to go here and you can see it right on your page. Whereas with JavaScript, you kind of start getting into like different concepts of like, what does it mean to invoke a function, or what does it mean to await a promise, or different kind of like things like that. And asynchronous JavaScript is a whole other animal that
Right.
has its own kind of quirks as well. And JavaScript in general has some of its own kind of quirks in general. So there's definitely a lot of kind of abstract concepts there. And when it comes to like core concepts of JavaScript, does it come to your mind like any kind of core concepts that you think are really important for someone to understand before they start to like really try to build out their own projects? Or do you think that, they could get a brief overview and then start building right away? Or kind of where do you land on the side of like really understanding JavaScript in full before you move on to something else versus, just kind of giving a rough overview and then just trying to figure it out as you go?
Yeah. I think that this is a great question because a lot of people will say, like, when should you move to frameworks like React and Angular, or when should you stick with just vanilla JS and learn the core concepts? And I think that once you can build some very basic projects, I mean, these do not need to be super complicated by any means, but some just super basic concept projects there that just help you solidify those core concepts of not just JavaScript, but just programming in general. And so I always encourage beginners to start with just very small projects that could be like 10 lines of code of JavaScript where you could have like a background color changer. But you start to like think through, okay, what do I need to do to build out this background color changer? Well, I need some sort of button. So there's your HTML. I should probably style it. So there's your CSS. So then thinking about, okay, I want a random color. How do I do that? And so you kind of just go down that rabbit hole. And so once you start off that small and then you build out with complexity. And once you start building out some of those beginner level projects and you start to wrap your head around the different JavaScript concepts, then I think at that point you can start to move on to different libraries and frameworks like React and Angular and Vue and Quick and all that fun stuff. But yeah, I know there's a lot of debate on like when you should move to frameworks and when you should move to projects versus when you should just stick with vanilla JS and coursework. But I think once you've just built out a few basic projects and you've kind of walked through that on your own outside from a tutorial, and again, just start off really small. You don't have to build out something complex, and then you start off smaller, and then you just work your way up from there. Then you start to wrap your head around, oh, okay, this is what JavaScript is. And you don't have to be like a master at it. I don't know if anybody's really a master of JavaScript there. But once you've built a few projects, then you can start to better understand like, oh, this is how JavaScript's actually supposed to work. And here's how I could move from, this concept to this concept. And then you'll be able to better understand and appreciate what the libraries and frameworks are doing for you once you've kind of wrapped your head around like the fundamentals there.
Absolutely agree. There's definitely a balance there to where, you definitely want to understand JavaScript and be like proficient with building just like basic vanilla kind of JavaScript applications. But also you could spend, years learning like the little subtle nuances in the JavaScript runtime and getting into the event loop and like really like minute details that you really don't use that much in your professional job, and stuff that you can kind of look up and kind of figure out on the go when you're already employed. So I think that once you have that kind of fundamental understanding and you can build some basic projects, then moving on to something like a framework's a good idea. But also I think some people try to move on too soon to where then they have to retroactively come back, learn some of those fundamentals a little bit better, and then move on. So I definitely think there's kind of a balance between the two there. And I know for me, when I was building projects, I would pick like a certain concept of JavaScript and just go build a project that uses that concept. So I'm going to build a project that just uses like some DOM manipulation. So getting an element, writing an element to the DOM, little things like that. Or I'll build a project that, I use a for loop, or I build another project that uses conditionals. Just kind of building some stuff with those things, getting a feel for it, testing them out, I think is a really good approach here. So one last question before we kind of run out of time here, Jessica. Is there anything that you're kind of looking forward to in 2024, or anything that, any technologies that you're looking forward to learning, or anything that Free Code Camp's up to that you can give us a sneak peek into, or anything like that?
Yeah. So I think for in terms of Free Code Camp, we're going to continue to update the JavaScript curriculum and fix the issues that have been brought up in the community there. But then we're also going to start moving forward with the front-end libraries curriculum, which is going to focus on React and state management libraries and testing. So we're really excited about that. So that's kind of what's on the horizon. We're also currently working to build out some of the other back-end certifications and making those more project-based, similar to what we're doing in the front-end situation. And then in terms of just like personal projects there, I'm really just interested. I spent most of my time just like personally and professionally in like the front end space. Like my first job after I got the apprenticeship, and then I moved on to a full time employee with them. It was all pretty much front end. I mean, I did a little bit of back end at my last job with like Node and Express and Nest and stuff like that, but I didn't spend too much time. I was mainly in the like front end space, kind of similar with JavaScript and working with like React and Gatsby and whatnot. And so I would like to kind of explore a little bit of the back end and actually just kind of step a little bit more outside of JavaScript. I've played around a little bit with Python, just like writing some different scripts and automation, stuff like that. But I think I would like to just explore, figure out which back-end language I want to play around with more, and maybe just figure out something to build so I can really learn a little bit more and just have fun as just like a personal project right there.
Yeah, and I think that sounds very cool. And I know that when I kind of first started learning, my focus was mainly front end, and my first job was just a UI engineer, so I mainly focused on JavaScript and React. But I also worked at a startup, so I got thrown into some backend stuff, and was kind of forced to learn about Python, Django, data migrations, all that stuff. Pretty early on, so
Right.
that was kind of a forcing function for me. But I definitely think that after learning like the backend better, I definitely have like a better kind of holistic view of web development and can kind of piece things together a little bit easier, like why you might make certain decisions on the front end that kind of align well with the back end and stuff like that. So I think for a lot of people, it's a good approach to kind of transition into that back end development. But then again, some people have their whole career and they just focus on front end and they do just fine with that. So yeah, very cool, Jessica. If people want to kind of follow you online or connect with you, is there anywhere they can go to do that?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on Twitter or X or whatever they want to call themselves these days. But I'm pretty active on there at CoderGirl 1991, and so you can find me on Twitter there. I'm not super active on LinkedIn, but I'm also active on the forum, and so you'll see me as one of the moderators on the FreeCodeCamp forum. But those are pretty much the two places. And of course on GitHub as well. You'll see me kind of hanging out there and working on different open source projects besides FreeCodeCamp. But yeah, mainly on like Twitter there, people can kind of reach out and connect with me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks so much for having me.